Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of study 2. This is our final video on the crises of 1921, and it ends with the new economic policy, which tried to turn around some of the devastating consequences of war communism. So this video covers the 10th Party Congress and the new economic policy. Here is a quote from Vladimir Lenin that relates to one of the big issues that was discussed at the 10th Party Congress, which is party unity. He said, "Comrades, this is no time to have an opposition. Either you're on this side or on the other, but then your weapon must be a gun and not an opposition." So he is saying we cannot have any factionalism or opposition within the party. We need to be a united front. So the key knowledge that this video will relate to, we'll talk briefly about war communism. We'll talk briefly, while we won't talk explicitly about the Kronstadt Rebellion, that was in our last video, the 10th Party Congress was taking place at the same time as the Kronstadt Rebellion. So it's all sort of framed around what is happening in Kronstadt at the same time. We'll look at the changes and continuities in political, social, cultural, and economic conditions that influence leaders to compromise and or achieve their revolutionary ideals, including the 10th Party Congress and the effects of the NEP. We'll also look at the role of significant individuals that influenced and changed society, including Vladimir Lenin and someone who we haven't talked about yet, Alexandra Kollontai. We'll talk about her in this video, and we'll also talk about her with regard to changes in women's rights in a future video. So that's the key knowledge that we'll look at in this video. So let's start with the 10th Party Congress, and particularly the aspect of the 10th Party Congress, which was a ban on factions. So here is a quote from Alexandra Kollontai, who was the leader of the workers' opposition. She said, "The workers' opposition considers that bureaucracy is our enemy, our scourge, and the greatest danger to the future existence of the Communist Party itself. The building of communism can and must be the work of the toiling masses themselves. The building of communism belongs to the workers." So a challenge faced by at least Lenin's branch of the Bolsheviks or the Communist Party was that Alexandra Kollontai formed the workers' opposition faction of Bolsheviks to criticize war communism. The workers' opposition wanted greater proletariat and trade union involvement in the day-to-day running of industry, so less centralization and bureaucracy. And they also criticized Trotsky's efforts to further militarize workplaces and put trade unions under government control. So essentially, the workers' opposition wanted more power in the hands of the workers and less in the hands of the Central Executive Committee. The Bolshevik response to this challenge was that at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Lenin passed the resolution on party unity. This resolution banned factions and ordered a purge of critics within the party. The outcome of this was that any criticism of Lenin's leadership was neutralized. Lenin's control over the party was restored and strengthened. There was increased pressure to abandon unpopular policies of war communism, particularly the militarization of the workplaces. There was increased pressure to abandon unpopular policies of war communism through the peasant revolts, and that was to do with grain requisitioning. This pressure to abandon, the policies that the workers' opposition put pressure on was to do with workers, the militarization of the workplace. And the resolution on party unity later, beyond our study, allowed Stalin to silence and remove his political opponents in purges. So that was the one aspect of the 10th Party Congress, was the workers' opposition and the subsequent ban on factionalism within the Bolsheviks. The second part of the 10th Party Congress was the introduction of the NEP. So here is a quote from historian Martin Macaulay. He said, "If war communism was a leap into socialism, then the NEP was a leap out of socialism. So the challenge that the Bolsheviks faced was that Lenin recognized that war communism had proven destructive to the economy and unpopular with workers and peasants. He accepted the need for a, quote, economic breathing spell and a, quote, strategic retreat from communism to elements of capitalism. So the response to this challenge was that at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin announced that war communism would come to an end. It would be abandoned. He introduced the NEP by legalizing the free market, replacing grain requisitioning with a 10% tax in kind. So what it means by tax in kind is that people were still starving at this point. And so the 10% tax in kind was not a monetary tax, but a tax of grain. And so peasants could grow enough to survive and to sustain themselves, but then 10% of their grain would go to the cities. Peasants were encouraged to sell grain for profit. The ration system was replaced with cash wages, so reintroducing money. And bourgeois managers were rehired as specialists to manage factories. Finally, cash bonuses were also offered to productive workers and managers. So sort of reinstating some of the competitive nature of capitalism, the competition where if you work hard, then you will receive more. The outcome of this Bolshevik response was an increase in production. So the NEP was overall hugely successful. Grain harvest doubled between 1921 and 1925. Wages for factory workers increased by 150%. Coal production increased by almost 11.5 million tons by 1925. Steel production also increased by 3.8 million tons by 1926, and electricity experienced enormous gains. It tripled between 1921 and 1924. Another outcome was that kulaks and so-called NEP men, kulaks being the rich peasants that Lenin had previously blamed grain shortages on, and NEP men being sort of bourgeois businessmen, took advantage of legal free trade to become incredibly wealthy. So you can see why this was a leap out of socialism, the NEP. Now, while the NEP was hugely successful, there was disagreement within the party about whether this was the right way to go. Hardliners in the Communist Party viewed the NEP as a retreat towards capitalism. Some workers also criticized the NEP, labeling it, rather than the new economic policy, they labeled it the new exploitation of the proletariat, NEP. Lenin responded by justifying the NEP as a temporary measure. He also declared that while elements of petty capitalism would return, the Soviet government retained control of industry, mining, heavy manufacture, and banking. So yes, we were going back to some of the policies of state capitalism, but also we would maintain state control of many aspects of the economy. And much like Stolypin's land reforms of 1906 to 1907, the NEP encouraged and increased class divisions by allowing some peasants to enrich themselves, going completely against the policies of war communism. The NEP disillusioned many young Bolsheviks who were eagerly awaiting the transition to socialism and communism. Writing in 1921, Alexandra Barmine said, and I quote, "We felt as though the revolution had been betrayed and it was time to quit the party. If money was reappearing, wouldn't rich people reappear too? Weren't we on the slippery slope that led back to capitalism? We put these questions to ourselves with feelings of anxiety." So for hardline communists, you can understand that this would have been a concern, even if it did have positive outcomes for ending the famine and increasing the production of different industries, because ideologically, it was definitely a step backwards. Now, let's talk briefly about the scissors crisis. So in 1923, with factories still struggling to produce enough goods to sell to the peasants while the countryside had recovered, prices for manufactured goods remained high while the price of grain dropped. It's simple supply and demand. There is high supply of grain because agriculture was doing exceptionally well. And so because there's high supply, the price drops. There were advances in manufactured goods, but not as much as agriculture. And so because the supply wasn't as high, the demand was much higher, which meant the price was higher. There was a fear that this would lead the peasants to start hoarding their produce again in a bid to drive prices up. Now, it's Trotsky who figuratively compared the widening gap between industrial and agricultural prices to an open pair of scissors that needed to be brought closer together. The government introduced price controls in the industrial and manufacturing sectors to close the blades. However, the scissors crisis really never completely resolved itself, even after the death of Lenin, even after our studies when the NEP was abandoned in 1928 by Stalin. This was a sort of ongoing issue for decades to come in Russia. Now let's have a look at some historical interpretations of the new economic policy, starting with Orlando Fage. He says, in 1921, Russia was on the verge of a new revolution, and the NEP was a desperate bid to stem the tide of popular revolution. So, I mean, if you look at the Kronstadt Rebellion, you can see, and also the strikes that were taking place in Petrograd and Moscow, you can see the signs of a new revolution, especially having considered the February Revolution and what brought that about. So Orlando Fage sees the NEP as a desperate bid to prevent a revolution. Robert Service said most Bolshevik leaders had never liked the NEP, regarding it as an excrescent boil on the body politic and at worst a malignant cancer. So that's just speaking to the ideological backwardness of the NEP, not backwardness, the ideological retreat of the NEP from more communist policies to more capitalist policies. Sheila Fitzpatrick said many communists felt deeply disillusioned. It seemed that the revolution had changed so little. So that's sort of backing up what Robert Service said. And the CPSU, the official history commissioned by Stalin, so this is clearly, as this image indicates, very biased in favor of the Bolsheviks, called the NEP a temporary but necessary step backwards in order to ensure the revolution survived. So the NEP had many effects, most of them positive in terms of agricultural output, industrial output, electrical output, but also it came with some ideological challenges for the communists. So that brings us to the end of this video on the 10th Party Congress and the NEP. I hope you found this video interesting and useful. This is one of our last videos for Area of Study 2. The next one will be starting to look at some of the overall continuities and changes that took place in Russia from 1896 to 1927. So again, hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.